June 4th, 1942. Dawn over the Pacific. On the flight deck of the Japanese aircraft carrier Akagi, flagship of the Pearl Harbor Strike Force, the mood is triumphant. The first attack on Midway Atoll is complete. Victory seems certain, but they are wrong. This ship, the most powerful war machine on the ocean, is already dead. Its fate was not sealed by the American bombers still hours away, but by a simple radio message sent weeks earlier. A message the Japanese themselves intercepted, read, and unknowingly confirmed. The men on this deck are ghosts. They just don't know it yet. The story of the Battle of Midway is almost always told as a miracle. The miracle at Midway. A tale of impossible odds, where a handful of heroic American dive bomber pilots, against all logic, found the Japanese fleet at its most vulnerable and, in 5 minutes, changed the course of the entire war. It's a powerful, compelling story. And while the courage of those pilots is undeniable, the story of a miracle is not the truth. It's the epilogue. The real story is far more fascinating. It's a story of a meticulous, high-stakes, intellectual duel, fought in secret, deep in a basement office, half a world away from the battle. The victory at Midway wasn't a last-minute miracle. It was a pre-planned execution. The Japanese fleet wasn't simply found by accident. It was lured into a perfectly prepared ambush. The Americans didn't just get lucky, they knew. They knew where the Japanese were going, and they were waiting. The key to this ambush, the weapon that truly doomed the Japanese carriers, was not a bomb or a torpedo. It was a piece of information, a lie, deliberately crafted and broadcast in the clear for Japanese ears to hear. A simple, mundane message about a problem with the freshwater system on Midway Atoll. A broken water condenser. This single, fabricated report was the bait, and the Japanese took it. In doing so, they unknowingly handed the U.S. Navy the single most important piece of intelligence of the Pacific War. They confirmed their own target, sprung the trap on themselves, and sealed the fate of their most powerful ships. The destruction of the carrier Akagi and its sister ships didn't begin when the first American bomb hit its deck. It began the moment a Japanese signals officer decoded that American message about fresh water and reported it up the chain of command. So, the question is not if the Americans got lucky. The question is how. How did a cryptic 2-letter code, AF, a single analyst's nagging suspicion, and a lie about plumbing combine to dismantle the most formidable naval force on the planet? How did a war of information, fought with codes and deceptions, lead directly to the physical inferno that would consume the flagship of the Pearl Harbor Strike Force? To understand how the Akagi was doomed before it ever left port, we must go back. Back to the darkest hours for the United States after Pearl Harbor, when the war seemed lost, and a small, undervalued intelligence unit was about to fight for its own credibility and the future of the Pacific. The spring of 1942 was a season of ghosts for the United States Navy. The ghosts of 8 battleships resting in the mud of Pearl Harbor. The ghosts of sailors lost in the warm waters off Java, where a combined Allied fleet had been systematically annihilated. The ghosts of Wake Island, of Guam, of the Philippines, where the flag had been lowered in defeat. In Europe, the war was a grinding stalemate. In the Pacific, it was a rout. 6 months after Pearl Harbor, the Empire of Japan was not just winning, it was building a new world order at lightning speed. Its naval aviators were the most experienced on the planet. Its ships, modern and fast. Its commanders, like Chuichi Nagumo and Isoroku Yamamoto, were victors. Their names synonymous with an unstoppable offensive that had stretched from Hawaii to the shores of India. The American public saw newsreels of determined factory workers and read headlines about heroic, but ultimately doomed, last stands. Privately, in the halls of power, the mood was far grimmer. The United States was losing the war. The only real American advantage in this vast ocean of defeat was hidden from sight, buried 15 feet underground in the dank, windowless basement of the 14th Naval District Administration Building at Pearl Harbor. There were no guns here, no ships, just the constant clattering noise of IBM tabulating machines, the stale air thick with cigarette smoke, and the quiet, obsessive intensity of 120 men working in shifts around the clock. This was Station HYPO, the Navy's Combat Intelligence Unit, and it was America's last best hope. The man in charge of this subterranean nerve center was Commander Joseph J. Rochefort. Rochefort was an anomaly in the spit and polish world of the U.S. Navy. He often showed up for his 12-hour shifts in a smoking jacket and slippers over his uniform. He was a brilliant linguist who had spent years in Japan, not as a spy, but as a student of the language and culture, trying to understand how the Japanese mind worked. He was a master of the esoteric art of cryptanalysis, but his real genius was in pattern recognition, not just in codes, but in people. He knew that navies, like men, have habits. They have procedures, routines, and tics. And he believed that in those habits, you could find the secrets they were trying to hide. His team was a motley collection of cryptanalysts, translators, and musicians from the ship's band of the USS California, which now lay half-sunk in the harbor. Their musical training gave them an uncanny ear for rhythm and pattern, essential for teasing signals out of the static. They called their workspace the dungeon, and for good reason. It was a pressure cooker, sealed off from the Hawaiian sun and the world outside. Their only connection to the war was a torrent of invisible noise. The thousands upon thousands of radio messages sent by the Imperial Japanese Navy every day. Their target was a formidable one, the Japanese Navy's main operational code, designated JN-25. It was a two-part system of terrifying complexity. First, a dictionary-sized codebook containing tens of thousands of five-digit number groups, each representing a word, a phrase, or a location. Then, to make it even harder, a second book of random additives was used to encipher the original code message before it was broadcast. To read a JN-25 message, you needed both the code book and the correct page of the additive book for that day. It was designed to be mathematically unbreakable. But Rochefort's team wasn't trying to break it with pure mathematics. They were trying to pick the lock. They knew that human beings, even meticulous military officers, make mistakes. A radio operator might use a key from the wrong day. A clerk might use a lazy shortcut. Through painstaking analysis of these tiny errors, by tracking where messages were sent from, who they were sent to, and how often, Hypo could begin to build a ghostly picture of the Japanese Navy. They couldn't always read the words in the messages, but they could read the music. They could tell who was talking to whom. They could identify a carrier division mobilizing here, a submarine squadron deploying there. They called it traffic analysis, and it was more art than science. This unorthodox approach, however, put Rochefort and his dungeon on a collision course with a second, more immediate enemy, their own bosses in Washington, D.C. The Navy's main cryptographic office in Washington, known as OP-20G, was HYPO's institutional rival. Where HYPO was scrappy, intuitive, and close to the action, OP-20G was bureaucratic, academic, and thousands of miles away. They believed in a slow, methodical, purely mathematical approach to code breaking. They viewed Rochefort's reliance on intuition and traffic analysis as dangerously reckless, a form of intellectual corner-cutting. They saw him not as a resourceful commander on the front lines, but as an eccentric amateur playing hunches. This wasn't just a professional disagreement. It was a bitter turf war fought over teletype machines. Washington demanded that all raw intelligence be sent to them for final analysis, a process that could take days or weeks. Rochefort, knowing that intelligence in wartime has a shelf life measured in hours, often bypassed them, feeding his findings directly to the intelligence officer for the Pacific Fleet, Commander Edwin T. Layton. Layton, a fellow Japanese language specialist and Rochefort's close friend, was the crucial link. He was the one who had to walk into Admiral Chester Nimitz's office, lay Rochefort's fragmented, often incomplete intelligence on the table, and say, "Sir, this is what the Japanese are going to do." The Battle of the Coral Sea in early May 1942 brought this internal conflict to a head. Rochefort's team, piecing together fragments of JN-25, correctly predicted a Japanese invasion force was headed for Port Moresby in New Guinea. It was a stunning intelligence coup. But because they could only decrypt about 15% of the messages, the picture was incomplete. They knew the what and the where, but not the precise when or with what strength. Washington, using the same data, came to a different, less urgent conclusion. Nimitz chose to trust Rochefort. He sent the carriers Lexington and Yorktown to intercept. The resulting battle was the first in history where the opposing ships never saw each other. It was a brutal, confusing affair fought entirely by aircraft. The U.S. Navy lost the carrier Lexington and suffered heavy damage to the Yorktown. Tactically, it was a loss. But strategically, it was a victory. The invasion of Port Moresby was turned back. For the first time in the war, a major Japanese offensive had been stopped. Yet for Rochefort, the outcome was double-edged. He had been right. But the incompleteness of his intelligence and the high cost of the battle gave his detractors in Washington ammunition. They could point to the loss of the Lexington and say, "See, his intelligence is dangerous. It's not enough to be partially right." The pressure on Rochefort intensified. The next time he made a major prediction, it had to be perfect. Anything less, and he would lose his credibility with Admiral Nimitz forever. And he knew, with a cold certainty, that there would be a next time, and it would be soon. Even before the last shots of the Coral Sea were fired, the radio waves over the Pacific began to hum with a new and alarming energy. The volume of Japanese naval communications surged to levels not seen since the week before Pearl Harbor. It was the sound of a vast and powerful machine spooling up for an even bigger operation. The Doolittle raid in April, while doing little material damage, had deeply embarrassed the Japanese high command. It proved that the homeland was vulnerable. Rochefort and his team could feel the response coming. It was in the airwaves. A massive, decisive blow was being planned. One intended to eliminate the U.S. Pacific Fleet for good. Working in the suffocating quiet of the dungeon, the analysts of Station Hypo leaned closer to their receivers and their worksheets. They were catching more fragments now. Call signs for every available Japanese aircraft carrier. Mentions of battleships, cruisers, and hundreds of support vessels. It was the entire combined fleet. All of it. Mobilizing for a single, colossal operation. But amidst this deafening roar of data, one small, persistent signal began to emerge. A single, two-letter code designator. It was appearing with increasing frequency in logistical messages. Messages about reconnaissance flights, water barges, and airbase preparations. It was clearly a place, a target. But its meaning was buried deep inside the 85% of the JN25 code they still couldn't read. It was just a ghost, a whisper in the static, a recurring pattern without a name. But to the men in the dungeon, who had trained themselves to find meaning in the meaningless, it was a starting point. It was a thread. And Joseph Rochefort sensed that if he could just pull on it hard enough, the entire Japanese plan might unravel. The thread was a two-letter cipher, AF. In the mountain of intercepted Japanese naval traffic, these two letters began appearing with ominous regularity. AF was to be the target of a major offensive. AF was the objective for the combined fleet. Reconnaissance flights were being scheduled to observe AF. Logistical plans were being drawn up to support the attack on AF. The entire weight of the Japanese military machine was being pointed at a ghost on the map, a place identified only by these two characters. For the United States Navy, finding the meaning of AF was no longer an intelligence problem. It was an existential one. Inside the dungeon, Joseph Rochefort was becoming obsessed. His team, poring over stacks of perforated paper and radio logs, began to see a faint outline. The reconnaissance flights being tasked to observe AF were originating from Japanese bases in the Marshall Islands. This was the first clue. A simple map and ruler told the story. From the Marshalls, planes could reach one critical American outpost at the edge of their range, Midway Atoll. They could not, however, reach Hawaii, let alone the west coast of the United States. Furthermore, a previous, partially deciphered message from months earlier had mentioned a Japanese seaplane tender near a location designated AFK. Rochefort's team had tentatively identified AFK as Midway. It was a fragment, a guess, but it fit. To Rochefort, the patterns were converging. The logic was inescapable. AF was Midway. But in Washington, the analysts at OP-20G were looking at the same data and seeing a different story. They were convinced AF stood for the Aleutian Islands, off the coast of Alaska, or worse, a target on the American mainland. Their reasoning was based on a different set of assumptions. The Japanese were, in fact, planning a secondary attack on the Aleutians. Washington's codebreakers saw the signals traffic for this diversionary attack and, lacking the frontline context of the Pacific, interpreted it as the main thrust. They saw Rochefort's focus on Midway as a dangerous fixation, a classic case of an analyst falling in love with his own theory. The teletype machine in Rochefort's basement began to clatter with insistent, condescending messages from the capital. They questioned his methodology. They demanded he stop issuing his own analysis and send them the raw data. The institutional rivalry had reached a breaking point at the worst possible moment. Admiral Nimitz was caught between two competing intelligence sources. On one hand, the official, cautious, and well-resourced office in Washington. On the other, the eccentric, intuitive, and proven commander in his own backyard. Trusting Rochefort on the Coral Sea had worked, but it had cost them a carrier. Trusting him now, if he was wrong, could cost them everything. The Pacific Fleet had only 3 carriers left. If Nimitz sent them to defend Midway on Rochefort's hunch, and the Japanese attack came somewhere else, the war in the Pacific would be over. Rochefort knew he couldn't win this argument with analysis alone. He needed more than a strong theory. He needed proof. He needed the Japanese to tell him he was right. If they wouldn't do it willingly, he would have to trick them into it. The idea that emerged was a stroke of genius, born from Rochefort's deep understanding of both military procedure and human nature. He wouldn't try to break the code. He would use the code makers themselves as his decryption tool. The plan was audacious in its simplicity. It relied on a single, mundane fact about Midway Atoll. As a tiny coral island with no natural source of fresh water, its garrison of a few thousand men was completely dependent on desalination plants. A broken water distiller would be a logistical crisis. On May 10th, Rochefort laid out his plan to Commander Layton. They would use the secure underwater telegraph cable that connected Pearl Harbor to Midway, a line they knew the Japanese could not tap, to issue a secret order. They would instruct the commander at Midway to use his radio to broadcast an uncoded message, or one in a low-grade code they knew the Japanese had broken. The message was to state, in plain language, that the island's main water distillation plant had suffered a major breakdown, and they were facing a critical water shortage. It was a perfect piece of bait. The message was plausible. Machinery breaks down. It was urgent. A garrison can't fight without water. And it was the kind of message a local commander would absolutely send up the chain of command. It was designed to look like a genuine American problem, a piece of administrative chatter that a Japanese listening post would eagerly intercept, translate, and file away as routine intelligence. Layton took the plan to Admiral Nimitz. It was a high-stakes gamble. If the Japanese didn't take the bait, or if they somehow saw through the deception, the Americans would have revealed their own intelligence capabilities and weaknesses for nothing. But Nimitz, a man who valued calculated risk, saw the elegance in the trap. He trusted Layton, and Layton trusted Rochefort. The order was approved. On May 19th, a secret dispatch traveled silently along the seabed from Pearl Harbor to Midway. A short time later, a radio operator on the atoll began tapping out the fake distress call. The lie, disguised as an urgent truth, radiated out into the vast emptiness of the Pacific. Midway Island, reporting, main evaporator breakdown, only have water for 2 weeks. The message was sent. The trap was set. In the stale air of the dungeon, the clatter of the tabulating machines seemed to fade. The cigarette smoke hung motionless. For Rochefort and his team, there was nothing left to do. They had cast their line into the invisible ocean of the airwaves. Now, they could only hold their breath, lean closer to their radio receivers, and listen to the static. They were listening for an echo. They were waiting for a Japanese signals officer, thousands of miles away, to report to his superiors that Target A, F, was running out of water. For 2 days, the dungeon at Pearl Harbor was a place of suspended animation. The lie was out there, floating in the ether. Now, there was only the wait. The men listened, their ears tuned to the rhythms of the Japanese fleet, sifting through thousands of coded signals for one specific echo. Then, on May 22nd, it came. A junior analyst, his eyes bleary from staring at endless columns of 5-digit numbers, flagged a message. It was short, routine, sent from a Japanese signals intelligence unit to the Naval High Command. The message was encrypted in the same JN25 code, but HYPO had made enough progress to read fragments. A translator was called over. He stared at the partially decoded intercept. The blood drained from his face. He walked it over to Rochefort's desk. The message reported that an American plain-language broadcast had been intercepted. It stated that location AF was experiencing a critical shortage of fresh water. The trap had snapped shut. The echo had returned. In the stale, smoky air of the basement, a wave of silent, ecstatic relief washed over the team. They had done it. They had forced the enemy's hand, making the Japanese intelligence service their unwitting confirmation source. The ghost on the map now had a name, and it was Midway. But this victory, won in the silent world of codes and whispers, was only the first step. The intelligence was useless unless the Admiral believed it, And believing it meant betting the entire war on Joseph Rochefort's hunch. The decoded intercept, the final, irrefutable piece of the puzzle, was hand-carried by Commander Layton to the office of Admiral Chester Nimitz. On Nimitz's desk lay two starkly different realities. One was Rochefort's urgent warning. The entire Japanese combined fleet is about to strike Midway in the first week of June, with the goal of luring out and destroying the U.S. Pacific Fleet. The other was a teletype from Washington, D.C., from OP-20-G, insisting that the main Japanese objective was the Aleutian Islands, or possibly even Hawaii. Washington dismissed the Midway theory as a dangerous obsession. Nimitz, a calm, deliberate man, now faced the single most important decision of his career. He looked at Layton. He had seen the cost of incomplete intelligence at the Coral Sea, but he had also seen that Rochefort's instincts, honed by years of studying the Japanese, had been right. He weighed the institutional certainty of Washington against the frontline conviction of his own team. In that moment, Nimitz made a choice that would define the rest of the war. He pushed the Washington dispatch aside. He would trust Rochefort completely. The decision was made. The ambush would be set at Midway. But an ambush requires an ambusher. Nimitz had just two carriers available, Enterprise and Hornet. The third, the USS Yorktown, was limping into Pearl Harbor, grievously wounded from the Coral Sea. A Japanese bomb had pierced its flight deck and exploded deep within the ship. The damage was catastrophic. Navy Yard assessors climbed all over the wounded vessel and delivered their verdict. To make her fully battle-worthy would take 90 days. Nimitz did not have 90 days. He had 3. He went to the shipyard himself. He walked the blackened, twisted decks of the Yorktown. He looked at the gaping hole. He then gave an order that bordered on the impossible. We must have this ship back in 72 hours. What followed was a true miracle, not of luck, but of labor. 1,400 shipyard workers descended on the Yorktown. They worked around the clock, in shifts, under giant floodlights. They did not have time to pour new concrete supports for the flight deck. They used wooden beams instead. They didn't have time to properly fix the internal structures. They welded steel plates over the damage. They didn't have time for formal dock trials. Repair crews were still on board, finishing their work, as the ship was being refueled and rearmed. On May 28th, less than 48 hours after entering dry dock, the USS Yorktown, patched, bleeding, but alive, steamed out of Pearl Harbor to rejoin the fleet. It was a ghost ship, returned from the dead, sailing to keep a rendezvous with destiny. While the welders at Pearl Harbor worked their frantic magic, another, far more powerful fleet was cleaving through the waters of the Western Pacific. This was the Kido Butai, the first air fleet of the Imperial Japanese Navy. 4 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, the same 4 that had devastated Pearl Harbor. They were commanded by Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, a man who had known nothing but victory for 6 straight months. On the bridge of his flagship, the Akagi, the mood was one of supreme, unshakable confidence. The plan for Operation MI, the invasion of Midway, was a masterpiece of Japanese naval doctrine. Complex, multi-pronged, and designed for a decisive battle. A diversionary force would strike the Aleutians, drawing American attention north. Then, Nagumo's carriers would smash Midway's air defenses. When the remnants of the U.S. Pacific Fleet inevitably sortied from Pearl Harbor to respond, they would sail directly into a waiting submarine screen and then face the guns of Admiral Yamamoto's main battleship force, trailing Nagumo at a distance. It was a perfect trap. This confidence was built on a foundation of seemingly solid intelligence. Their spies had reported no unusual activity at Pearl Harbor. Their radio intercepts indicated that the American carriers were scattered. The Yorktown, they believed, had been sunk at the Coral Sea. The Lexington certainly was. That left at most 2 American carriers, which their intelligence placed far away, possibly near the Solomon Islands. The idea that 3 American carriers could be waiting for them, fully armed and prepared, northeast of Midway, was not just unlikely, it was considered impossible. Their own reconnaissance plan, a mission codenamed Operation K, had failed. The plan called for long-range seaplanes to fly over Pearl Harbor to verify the location of the U.S. carriers just before the Midway operation began. But when the Japanese submarine sent to refuel the planes arrived at its designated rendezvous, a remote atoll, it found an American warship waiting there. The reconnaissance flight was canceled. In the grand, complex machinery of the Japanese plan, this small failure was dismissed as a minor inconvenience. It should have been a screaming alarm bell. It told them the Americans were active in places they shouldn't be. But in the grip of victory disease, the unshakable belief in their own superiority, the warning was not heard. Nagumo's fleet continued to sail east, blind to the fact that the enemy knew they were coming, and deaf to the silence that should have been their loudest warning. By June 2nd, the American trap was set. Task Force 16, with the carriers Enterprise and Hornet, under the command of Admiral Raymond Spruance, reached their designated station. It was an empty patch of ocean 325 miles northeast of Midway, a position codenamed Point Luck. A day later, they were joined by the resurrected Yorktown and its escorts. Wave. Torpedo Squadron 3 from the resurrected USS Yorktown. They had a slightly better fighter escort, and their attack was better coordinated, but the result was the same. The Zeros, swarming like angry hornets, tore into them. Of the 12 torpedo planes, 10 were shot down. Their torpedoes ran wide or were evaded. It was 10:15 in the morning. On the bridge of the USS Enterprise, Admiral Raymond Spruance listened to the reports filtering in. The picture they painted was one of unmitigated catastrophe. The entire first wave of torpedo attacks, the spearhead of the American ambush, had been wiped out. 41 torpedo planes had been sent in. 37 had been lost. More than 70 pilots and gunners were gone. And for all that sacrifice, the sum total of their achievement was 0. Not a single bomb. Not a single torpedo had touched the Japanese carriers. The intelligence from Rochefort's dungeon had been perfect. The trap had been set, and it had failed. The plans, so brilliant on paper, had shattered against the hard reality of Japanese combat superiority. From the American perspective, the battle was turning into a one-sided slaughter. The ambush had backfired. On the bridge of the Akagi, Admiral Nagumo watched the last American torpedo plane burn on the horizon. His fleet was untouched. The attacks had been laughably ineffective. This easy, almost effortless victory was a powerful confirmation of everything he believed, in the superiority of his pilots, his planes, and his own tactical judgment. But as he looked out over his victorious fleet, he was blind to the true cost of this victory. The slaughter of the American torpedo squadrons wasn't the end of the attack, it was the setup, and the real price was about to come due. On the bridge of the Akagi, the mood was not one of alarm, but of irritation. The slaughter of the American torpedo planes had been a messy, time-consuming affair. To evade the attacks, Admiral Nagumo had been forced to order sharp, defensive turns, disrupting his own operational timetable. His pristine battle plan was being smudged by the desperate, futile attacks of an enemy he was supposed to have surprised. This disruption had created a deadly problem. Nagumo's first strike on Midway had returned, low on fuel. At the same time, his combat air patrol, the Zeros that had just annihilated the American torpedo squadrons, were also running low and needed to land, rearm, and refuel. But just as this delicate aerial ballet began, a scout plane had reported the unthinkable. An American carrier had been sighted. Suddenly, the mission changed. The planes being armed with land attack bombs for a second strike on Midway were now useless. Nagumo needed to attack the American ship. He gave a fateful order: rearm the planes with torpedoes. On the hangar decks below, chaos erupted. This was not a simple switch. A Type 91 aerial torpedo was a 1-ton, 18-foot-long precision instrument. Changing from a bomb to a torpedo was a slow, difficult process, involving specialized hoists and carts. The armorers, sweating in the poorly ventilated spaces, began the frantic work. They unbolted the 800-kilogram land bombs, lowered them onto ordnance carts, and simply pushed them to the side of the hangar to make room for the torpedoes being wheeled in. They had no time to send the bombs back down to the safety of the armored magazines. Procedure was abandoned for speed. The hangar decks of the Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu became arsenals strewn with unsecured explosives. Fuel lines snaked across the floors, gassing up the aircraft for the new mission.
And everywhere there were planes, dozens of them, packed wingtip to wingtip, their tanks full, their engines waiting. The carriers, symbols of Japan's naval might, had been turned into floating powder kegs. The slightest spark could set them off. They were at the absolute peak of their offensive power, and simultaneously, at the absolute peak of their vulnerability. All they needed was a few more minutes to clear the decks, launch their aircraft, and unleash hell on the American fleet. High above, and miles to the south, Another drama was unfolding in the cockpit of an SBD Dauntless dive bomber. Lieutenant Commander C. Wade McCluskey, leading the air group from the USS Enterprise, was lost. He and his 32 bombers were at the edge of their operational range. Their fuel gauges were dropping into the red. According to his navigation, he should have found the Japanese fleet an hour ago, but the ocean below was empty.
He was at his point of no return, the moment when a pilot must choose between turning back to save his plane and his life, or pushing on into the unknown. Standard procedure was clear: turn back. His fighter escort had already given up and returned to the Enterprise. McCluskey's men were alone, low on fuel, and staring at a vast, empty expanse of blue. To continue the search was to risk every single one of them ditching in the ocean, but something held him, a stubborn refusal to accept failure. And then he saw it. A thin, white line on the water below. A wake. A single ship, moving fast, heading northeast. 3 American carriers, with their combined air groups, were now hidden under the vast Pacific sky, waiting. They were positioned on the flank of Nagumo's expected approach. They were there because Rochefort had told them where the Japanese would be. And the Japanese had told Rochefort. The atmosphere on the American ships was electric with tension and anticipation. Every man, from the admirals on the bridge to the pilots in the ready rooms, knew what was at stake. They were outnumbered and outgunned. The Japanese ships were faster, their pilots more experienced, their torpedoes superior. The Americans had only one advantage, but it was the only one that mattered: the element of surprise. They were the hunters, waiting for the prey to walk into the killing ground. On the morning of June 4th, the wait was over. Long-range patrol planes from Midway spotted the Japanese fleet. The message flashed back to Nimitz at Pearl Harbor and to the carriers at Point Luck. Enemy carriers sighted. The intelligence phase of the war was over. The perfect, elegant plan conceived in a basement had delivered the Japanese fleet to their doorstep. Now, everything depended on the brutal, chaotic reality of combat. On the decks of the Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, engines coughed to life. One by one, the dive bombers and torpedo planes lifted off the decks, forming up and turning south, toward the coordinates on their map boards. They were flying on the strength of a single, powerful idea: that the enemy was exactly where they were supposed to be. The plan was about to collide with the fog of war. At 0917, Lieutenant Commander John C. Waldron, leading Torpedo Squadron 8 from the carrier Hornet, broke radio silence. His voice, crackling with static and resolve, was a death sentence. Enemy carriers in sight. He had found them, but he was alone. Earlier that morning, the Hornet's entire air group had launched and flown on a faulty heading. The dive bombers and fighters, flying high above, saw nothing but empty ocean and turned away. Waldron, flying low in his slow, obsolete TBD Devastator torpedo plane, disagreed. He trusted his gut, his training, and his reading of the wind. He broke formation, taking his 15 planes on a different, more southerly course, a direct line to where he knew the Japanese must be. It was an act of profound insubordination and profound courage. Before the mission, he had told his men, "If there is only one plane left to make a final run-in, I want that man to go in and get a hit." Now, looking at the 4 Japanese carriers maneuvering on the horizon, he knew that grim prophecy was about to be tested. He had no fighter cover, no dive bombers to distract the enemy. It was just 15 planes against the most powerful carrier fleet on the planet. On the bridge of the Akagi, lookouts screamed. Torpedo planes, low on the water, approaching from the northeast. The alarm bells were a formality. Admiral Nagumo's fleet had been in a state of high alert for hours. The response was instantaneous and brutally efficient. The 4 carriers turned into the wind, not to launch their own planes, but to present their narrowest profiles to the attackers. Their anti-aircraft batteries opened up, stitching the sky with black puffs of smoke. And then, the Zeros came down. The Japanese Combat Air Patrol, dozens of the world's most advanced fighter aircraft, flown by the world's best pilots, had been circling high above, waiting. They fell upon Waldron's squadron like wolves on a flock of sheep. The TBD Devastator was a relic from another era. It was slow, under-armored, and when it dropped its torpedo, it had to fly straight and level for an agonizingly long time. Against the nimble, heavily armed Zeros, it was a death trap. The radio channels, which had been alive with the hunt, fell silent. They were replaced by the horrifying sounds of the battle, overheard by the other American squadrons still searching. The staccato chatter of machine guns, the shouts of pilots, And then, one by one, the silence of downed aircraft. For the men of Torpedo 8, it was a methodical, systematic slaughter. Their planes were ripped apart by cannon fire, cockpits shattered, engines caught fire, trailing black smoke as they cartwheeled into the sea. They were shot down before they could even get into an attack position. A few, through sheer determination, pressed on, flying through a wall of steel. They dropped their torpedoes. Every single one missed. In less than 10 minutes, it was over. Of the 15 planes that followed John Waldron, all 15 were shot down. 30 men had taken off from the Hornet. One, Ensign George Gay, survived, clinging to a seat cushion in the water, a lone witness to the annihilation of his squadron. But the ordeal wasn't over. It was just beginning. Minutes later, from the northeast came Torpedo Squadron 6 from the USS Enterprise. 14 Devastators, this time with a small fighter escort. The Zeros, refueled and rearmed with bloodthirsty efficiency, rose to meet them. The fight was a repeat of the first massacre. The escorting American Wildcat fighters were overwhelmed. The torpedo planes were hacked out of the sky. 10 of the 14 were destroyed. Not a single hit was scored. Then, from the southeast, came the final. It was a Japanese destroyer, the Arashi. It was alone, racing to catch up to its fleet. McCluskey made a deduction that would alter history. The destroyer had been left behind, probably chasing an American submarine. Now it was speeding to rejoin its formation. Therefore, the Japanese fleet was not where they thought it would be. It was in the direction the Arashi was going. He made the decision. A click of his radio switch, a hand signal to his squadron. They changed course, banking to follow the lone destroyer. It was a desperate gamble, based on a single observation and a flash of intuition. Every minute he flew north was a minute of fuel he couldn't use to get home. He was betting the lives of all his men on the hunch that this single ship would lead him to the prize. On the flight deck of the Akagi, the chaos was finally resolving into deadly order. The last of the returning Zeros had landed. The deck was being cleared for the launch of the counterstrike. The first fighters were being moved into position, their engines sputtering to life. The flight deck crews, in their color-coded jerseys, moved with practiced urgency. In perhaps 5 more minutes, the first wave would be airborne, and the tactical advantage would swing irrevocably back to Japan. The window of American opportunity, bought with the blood of the torpedo pilots, was slamming shut. It was at that exact moment, at 10:22 a.m., that Wade McCluskey's gamble paid off. Breaking through a thin layer of clouds, he saw them. Not a smudge on the horizon, but a vision from a bomber pilot's dream. 4 Japanese carriers sailing in a perfect box formation, and on their decks, a sight that made his heart pound. The red circles of the rising sun painted on the flight decks. And parked on those circles, dozens of aircraft, neatly arranged wingtip to wingtip, glistening with fuel, waiting to be launched. He saw the Zeros of the Combat Air Patrol, still flying low after destroying the last of the torpedo planes, completely out of position to intercept an attack from high altitude. He had not found a fleet. He had found the perfect target at the perfect time. The one moment in the entire day when a victory was possible. "McCluskey, to all planes!" His voice cut through the radio. "Follow me!" He rolled his dauntless bomber onto its wing, pointing the nose almost straight down at the sea. He had his choice of targets. He chose the lead carrier, the one with the distinctive island superstructure on its port side, the flagship, the Akagi. The scream of the wind filled his cockpit as his plane accelerated in the 70-degree dive. The deck of the Akagi swelled to fill his windscreen. He could see the frantic, tiny figures of the deck crew pointing up, just now realizing their doom was falling from the sky. He held the dive, steadying his aim, the crosshair centered on the red circle just behind the forward elevator. At 1,500 feet, he pulled the release. The half-ton bomb detached from the belly of his plane, and down it went. A single 1,000-pound messenger of fate, aimed at the heart of an empire. It was falling towards a flight deck packed with fully fueled aircraft, unsecured torpedoes, and stacked high-explosive bombs. The Akagi had been turned into its own funeral pyre. It just hadn't been lit yet. The 1,000-pound bomb that struck the Akagi was not the cause of its destruction. It was merely the percussion cap. The real explosive charge had been packed and primed weeks before, not by American armorers, but by the decisions of the Japanese High Command itself. The fire that erupted on the flight deck was not just a chemical reaction of fuel and ordnance. It was the physical manifestation of a catastrophic intelligence failure. This was the end of a chain reaction that began not in the sky, but in the quiet of a basement in Pearl Harbor. The bomb's devastating effect was only possible because it struck a deck crowded with fueled planes and unsecured bombs, a direct result of Admiral Nagumo's frantic order to rearm. That order was given only because his own flawed plan had put him in an impossible position, caught between refueling his first strike wave and launching a second. The window for that bomb to be so devastatingly effective, that brief 5-minute period of supreme vulnerability, was not an accident of timing. It was a window bought and paid for blood. It was purchased by the men of Torpedo Squadron 8, 6, and 3. Their suicidal attacks, which seemed so futile, had achieved something tactically decisive. They had forced Nagumo's carriers into defensive maneuvers, disrupting their launch cycle. And, most critically, they had pulled the lethal Japanese Zero fighters down to the wave tops. The sky above the Kido Butai was left wide open. The sacrifice of the torpedo pilots was not in vain. It was the key that unlocked the Japanese fleet's defenses. And who was there to fly through that open door? A group of dive bombers who were lost, low on fuel, and hours from their carrier. They were there only because their commander, Wade McCluskey, made a gambler's choice to follow a single, lone destroyer, betting the lives of his men on a hunch, a moment of individual initiative that bent the arc of the war. But McCluskey and his bombers were only in that patch of ocean in the first place because Admiral Nimitz had sent them there. He had sent his entire remaining carrier force, including the resurrected Yorktown, a ship held together by fresh welds and sheer will, to a precise spot on the map, codenamed Point Luck. He did this against the explicit advice of his own superiors in Washington, betting the entire Pacific War on the word of one man. That man was Joseph Rochefort, a commander who worked in his slippers, leading a team of codebreakers and musicians in a windowless dungeon. The victory at Midway was not a miracle. It was an intellectual masterpiece, executed by an admiral who had the courage to trust his intelligence officers, and by intelligence officers who had the genius to turn a simple lie about a broken water condenser into the key that would unlock an empire's secrets. The story of Midway is often remembered for 5 spectacular minutes of bombing, but the battle was truly won in the preceding weeks. It was won by the 1,400 workers who rebuilt the Yorktown in 48 hours. It was won by the analysts who saw a pattern in the static. It was won by Commander Layton, who carried the truth from the dungeon to the Admiral's office. And it was won by Nimitz, who listened. The inferno on the Akagi's flight deck was the final spectacular echo of a single whispered message. It proved that a war is not just fought with ships and planes, but with information. That victory and defeat are not decided only on the day of battle, but in the moments when one side understands a truth that the other has failed to see. The physical destruction of the most powerful fleet on the planet was merely a consequence. The real, mortal blow had been struck weeks earlier, when one side correctly interpreted a single, tiny fragment of information, and the other didn't even notice it had answered the very question that would lead to its own annihilation. The Japanese Empire built the most formidable carrier fleet in the world, only to lose it the moment it graciously confirmed the answer to the one question that was designed to destroy it.